Good morning and welcome to another Spirecast episode. We're excited to have you join us today. Spirecast is a new opportunity that Spire has created to keep you in the know on some of the latest leadership and important information that would be important for leaders to know throughout the country. Today, we are excited to have Jerry Harris with us from the Crossing Church. Jerry's going to be joining us just in a few minutes. We're going to talk a little bit about his talk at the Spire Virtual Conference, Virtual Conference 2020, and ways that we can continue to be thinking about church leadership and church growth from that. But before we do, we have a Spire webinar that's going to be happening this Wednesday at 11 a.m. Mountain Time or 1 p.m. Eastern Time. It's about engagement. It's going to be called Embracing Engagement, and we're really excited to have Matt Engel, who's going to be leading that, join us today just to tell us a little bit about what we can expect from that webinar. Matt?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Excited to be here. Excited to be with you guys Wednesday, and kind of really rethink this term that I think we've elevated and glorified as engagement, but we've really not changed the functional thing of we're really talking about butts and seats. And so, the old metric of measuring butts, budgets, baptisms, and buildings, this idea is really, it's more of a 360 view of the person that's not necessarily in the building. And it's different than just liking your Facebook page, but there's a totality at which we can actually begin to understand the progression of people and how do we leverage tools to actually move people through growth experiences by these flares that happen or these activities that happen. And we can get that holistic understanding of the growth of people versus just an activity or participation. So excited to unpack that Wednesday with you and share about all the learnings that we're seeing, and and just be a blessing to everybody as needed.
Fantastic. Matt, thank you so much for joining us on Wednesday. We'll look forward to seeing you then. Make sure that you sign up for that webinar at spire.network/webinars. You can see that across the bottom of the screen, spire.network/webinars. We'll also be talking about a very specific tool that we can use for engagement using an SMS tool called Thrive, which is really an exciting tool. Instead of being passive with SMS, it's really an active opportunity for us to not only increase engagement, but to find new ways to communicate with the congregation. So excited about that, Matt. We'll look forward to seeing you on Wednesday.
Yeah, thanks, Chris.
You bet. Take care. So I'd like to bring in Jerry Harris, if we could. Jerry is the lead pastor at The Crossing in Quincy, Illinois. I say Quincy, Illinois, but the truth is there are 11 locations in close proximity to Quincy, and actually involving 3 different states. And so there's an awful lot of challenge there with regard to leading such a large staff as well as multiple locations. But we're super excited to have Jerry with us today to talk a little bit about his talk from the 2020 virtual conference, which was Wrecking the Rural Roof. And so excited to be able to talk a little bit about that. Jerry, welcome. Tell me how folks at The Crossing been? How's your staff been in the early part here of 2021?
Good. We've been doing very well, and I'm very bullish about the future. I think that there's differences depending upon where you are in the country, what your ministry setting is. there may be some general rules that we might see as we're looking, but in the rural areas, particularly where we are, there was a greatly diminished effect that we felt. It was interesting that Quincy, Illinois, was actually on the New York Times top 10 list for worst places having to do with COVID. And that was only about 5 or 6 weeks ago. And you would have never known it, though, if you live here. So it was interesting. We were also the Adams County, our county, was the number one county for vaccinations. So we were running ahead of every other county in Illinois with people getting vaccinated. So it hasn't affected us in nearly the way I think it's affected a lot of churches. This last weekend, we were 72.5% of our pre-COVID attendance number at a live location.
That's great.
So yeah, we're doing fine there, and I'm expecting that we'll be somewhere around 85% when we hit Easter, before Easter. And then we'll be chasing strays after that to get back to live locations. And of course, we've had great enhancement with regards to our online presence and what we've been doing there. So we're in great shape. I feel very, very optimistic, very bullish about our future.
That's fantastic. With so many locations and with so many different states, different regulations, different guidelines, different numbers of what who can come back and how many can come. There has to just be some incredible challenges that you and your team have been facing through this season.
We did. Missouri was very open. Interestingly, though, one of our Missouri locations, Kirksville, Missouri, is now the most restrictive, not because of the state, but because of city regulations. And they're still they're requiring 100% mask wearing in a church setting environment. So like you can't take your mask off to sing or something like that. And we do our very best to be in good relationship with the county boards of health. But Missouri had its rules. Iowa, we're in Iowa, and Iowa had not very much in the way of restriction through the process. Illinois, very restrictive, but we're downstate in Illinois and in a rural area in Illinois. And so a lot of those rules and regulations just really didn't reach down here. And there's a lot of state law that affects that. And our governor was taken to court over some of that and had to release restrictions on churches pretty early. So I know that's different in other states, but that's kind of our circumstance.
I know it's been difficult all over. And if you are, in a rural church, a lot of the things today that Jerry's going to share from his talk and some of the questions that we get to have afterward are going to be really great for you. But if you are maybe in a little bit more of a metropolitan setting, I guarantee that there are folks who are coming in or that are crossing your path that are from more of a rural location as well. And so I think there's some great things that Jerry shares in his virtual conference 2020 talk that are pertinent for every leader. And so excited to go ahead and take a look at that talk now.
Jesus spent a disproportionate amount of time bringing life to these rural, relatively small towns. He brought vitality to places otherwise marked by poverty, dysfunction, and abuse. Just think about it for a minute. He brought meals to the starving, health to the hurting and sick, companion to the lonely, and salvation to the lost. And the need today in rural America for a visitation of Jesus Christ is no different. Sadly, our rural communities are often marked by dilapidated church buildings, sleepy programming, and burned out pastors. How encouraging is it that Jesus paid attention to the unincorporated, the people who, while not less than, were out of focus to everybody else? carpenters and fabricators, farmers and welders, regular people. The question becomes, will the people of God, like Jesus, choose to invest themselves into the same beautiful rustic spaces? Are we willing to get off the pavement of upscale traditional ministry and onto the gravel roads of the rural church? Or are we indifferent to the plight of the church in the little places, unable or unwilling to see their incredible potential and unwilling to do a pioneering work in the places forgotten to so many? It's possible that a new generation of leaders might break up these spiritual ghost towns, not with persuasive words of human wisdom, but a demonstration of the Spirit and of power. It's so great to connect with you today. You're committed leaders catalyzing eternal change across the country and around the world. I want to thank Spire for giving me an opportunity to share with you about the demographics of my ministry calling, as well as so many others across the country. Forgotonia. Would you believe that's a real place? The place is real, but the name was more of a publicity stunt. It was adopted by 14 counties in west central Illinois that were intentionally neglected by the state and federal government with regards to interstate and rail service in the early 1970s. Without interstate highway access, it was denied decent transportation for commerce, as other towns and cities benefited from them. Businesses and not-for-profit entities just dried up and left the area, and calls for fair treatment with regards to tax dollars for infrastructure fell on deaf ears in government. So one man, Neil Gamm, came up with a stunt to get the attention of the country. He started petitions in 14 Illinois counties to choose to declare its independence from America and become an independent country. He did this for the purpose of declaring war and then promptly surrendering, making the area eligible for foreign aid under the law. Gamm even went so far as to declare a capital, Fandon, Illinois, a ghost town, and a flag, a white one, for surrender. For a time, Gamm got some attention for this stunt, but a year later, Forgotonia reverted back to its namesake, lost to the tax dollars and attention that flowed unabated to the larger cities. Over the last 40 years, West Central Illinois and Northeast Missouri have been slowly receiving the attention that produces the infrastructure that other cities have been enjoying, but it's really never caught up with the larger cities. The question is, what can God accomplish in places like this with the right leader? The answer is great things. You can ask Matt Merrill in Washington, Indiana, and now Vincennes, Indiana. You might ask Darrell Land in Jasper or Lagodi, Indiana. You could ask Jim Putman in Post Falls, Idaho. The Crossing has gone from a small traditional church of 230 22 years ago to a church of over 7,000 in 11 locations across 3 states. We've baptized over 5,000 people in the last 6 years. And COVID-19 hasn't taken hold of the church in the rural areas like in the metro ones. Jesus came from a place just like this. You could use Bethlehem as an example. Population, just a few hundred when Jesus was born. He grew up in Nazareth, population of about 480. He chose Capernaum, population 1,500. He chose an insignificant country, Israel. He chose insignificant people like David, like shepherds at his birth, like fishermen, tax collectors, and prostitutes to be his disciples. Why wouldn't he choose places like that today? It would be just like him. And his disciples changed the world from places like this. And so can we, empowered by his Spirit. Now I want us to zero in on the little town of Capernaum and an incredible story of risk and sacrifice and great reward recorded in Mark 2, 1 through 12. It says, a few days later, Jesus again entered Capernaum, and the people heard that he'd come home. They gathered in such large numbers that there was no room left, not even outside the door. And he preached the word to them. Some men came, bringing to him a paralyzed man, carried by 4 of them. Since they could not get him to Jesus because of the crowd, they made an opening in the roof above Jesus by digging through it, and then lowered the mat the man was lying on. And when Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralyzed man, "Son, your sins are forgiven." Now, some teachers of the law were sitting there thinking to themselves, "Why does this fellow talk like that? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone?" Immediately, Jesus knew in his spirit that this is what they were thinking in their hearts. He said to them, "Why are you thinking these things? Which is easier, to say to this paralyzed man, 'Your sins are forgiven,' or to say, 'Get up, take your mat, and walk'? But I want you to know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins." So he said to the man, "I tell you, get up, take your mat, and go home." He got up, took his mat, and walked out in full view of them all. This amazed everyone, and they praised God, saying, "We have never seen anything like this." Now, there were some big risks taken in this story. The 4 men took a risk by destroying a perfectly good roof. Jesus took a huge risk by being accused of blasphemy. Even the paralytic took a risk, being willing to risk even further injury. It made me ask the question of myself, what have I ever really risked to help someone who desperately needed it? I think about all the cost and fears associated with that story. What have I been willing to give up? What would motivate me to take a risk? What lines would I cross? The truth is, much of my life is lived out of sight, out of mind. That's how I would see the people packed in to hear Jesus speak that day. See, they were more concerned about seeing Jesus themselves than someone else seeing him. But not these 4 friends. Would I do whatever it takes to reach people who are far from God? Would I do fresh things in fresh ways to reach people no one else is reaching? Would I take big, faith-filled risks and never insult God with small thinking or safe living? To many of us, rural places and people are like that. They're out of sight, out of mind. If there's not a Target or a Chick-fil-A, I'm out. People aren't any different. We live our lives surrounded by people on mats, spiritual mats. They may be paralyzed in their marriage or their family or their job or in their social relationships. Today, they are paralyzed by fear. And now with COVID more than ever. They live day after day in the same repetitive cycle without the answers that only the gospel can give them. Without someone making an effort to change the status quo, there won't be any change in that. Who do you see around you today? And if you don't see them, why not? Is there a roof in the way? Is it a roof of your own personal priorities? Things that mostly focus back on you? I believe the truth is that we're our own biggest obstacle when it comes to truly making a difference, because the roof is inside of here. We need a breakthrough. A breakthrough is when an obstacle becomes an opening. These 4 guys made a literal breakthrough through a very real roof. Today's rural churches need a breakthrough, but it won't be easy. Never forget that with every breakthrough, there is a pile of rubble on the floor that was once part of an important construction. There had to be a time of strategy in the story. I think about the guy that came up with this crazy plan and the work he had to do to convince his friends. Maybe you need some convincing about rural ministry. Rural churches can have a big influence in a community. You don't have to be as creative because older ideas are completely fresh in rural communities. You also have access to cheap technology. City churches, well, they're upgrading their equipment, and there are tons of unaffected and disconnected people in rural communities. Buildings and property are often found at bargain basement prices. You can instantly become a hub for the community, and you'll get plenty of free media attention, trust me. It's a reproducible model that works so well with multi-site strategy, mergers, acquisitions, and all of that together can make that ministry an evangelistic magnet. All that to say that targeting rural or micropolitan communities might be an unlikely strategy, but it has proven to be a great strategy to wreck the roof and get more people to Jesus. But at some point, it had to become more than just talk. Those four friends had to get up on that roof and start wrecking it. There comes a time when we can't just sit there anymore. We can't just talk about it. We have to take action. Now, there was nothing supernatural or miraculous about what they did, but it opened the door to that very thing. And it's the same for us now. We're not going to just sit here. We're going to have to do something about it. There has to be a moment where declaration turns into demonstration. Now, here are 4 lessons from this story that I think applies to the church today. Number 1, I see a church more concerned about being inside than those people who are outside. I wonder if that might describe some of our churches today. Are we more concerned about being inside than those people being outside, that are outside? We have to be more outwardly focused, and I see that in this story. I see 4 men. Here's the second thing. I see 4 men more concerned about their friends seeing Jesus than they are seeing Jesus themselves. When are we going to be more concerned about others seeing Jesus than seeing him ourselves, or getting the thing that makes us more comfortable, the context where ministry is easier for us? Maybe we need to give those things up because there's so many that haven't heard, that haven't responded. Number 3, I see these 4 guys turning an obstacle into an opportunity. Wow. I mean, this is just an incredible story. How do you see your obstacles today? Because maybe they're just cleverly disguised opportunities. If we could get past the negative thinking and start thinking about what God might do in this situation, maybe we'd see more opportunities and we'd see less obstacles. But the thing I see that's the greatest is I see a paralyzed man walking home. I mean, that's miraculous. And you know what? In rural communities, I see that every week. I can't remember when we haven't had a baptism in over 10 years. Every week, paralyzed people walk home. Every week, God does a greater miracle in one of our locations than he did that day. Because that paralyzed man ended up dying and not having the use of his legs. But the things that we do in our churches, they last for eternity. I want to challenge you today to consider that vision. I want you to imagine yourself making a major impact in what might be considered a really unlikely place. Stretch out in Jesus' name. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Jerry. Really great. It was as great as when it was originally broadcast, and really enjoy your thoughts, and really enjoy just the way that you incorporate that story into you're really inspiring us to be able to think beyond maybe our metropolitan mindsets, and maybe to be able to think in terms of what we can do to reach those lost around us, even in the rural setting. I had just a couple of quick questions, and I'm going to ask everybody who's viewing and watching today. If you have some questions for Jerry, just go ahead and put those in the comments section. We'll be happy to get to your question. But I thought maybe you could just share with us, Jerry, how we can best invest in the rural church, in rural communities that we either serve in or we serve near? How can we best invest in them in particular?
So when you're talking about investing, you're talking about a leader investing in a rural community. I think number one, go big or stay home. People in rural communities, they live in close proximity with each other. So I grew up on the west side of Indianapolis. So you could go to a movie theater, you wouldn't see anybody you knew. You went to the grocery store, you didn't see anybody you knew. you did. I mean, you could really have a lot of anonymity in a metropolitan area or a near metropolitan area. That's not the case in micropolitan or rural communities. People know one another, and there is a different level of caring and of community in those settings than there are in metropolitan settings. People know one another. I mean, depending on the size of your community, if you're living in that community, people probably know if you're driving where you're coming from and where you're going and when you are liable to be back. So people get in one another's business a lot more, and so the investment that you have to make is you need to live in that community, you need to invest in that community, and that's why, I mean, we broke every rule of church planting when we did what we did in our communities, because we didn't go into small spaces and try to grow the church. Instead, what we did was we made big investments, which were high risk choices, to show the community that we were there to stay, that we weren't going to be somebody that could pull out of that community as quickly as we rolled in. And I think that was one of the big things that really helped us, that we leveraged a lot on the front end. And so I think when you think about investing in a community as a leader, I mean, it's all in.
Yeah, I like that go big or go home kind of idea. And you talk about risking big in the talk. Maybe you can share just a little bit in particular, what type of things were big risks that you've seen get the most return from in reaching people? What maybe things in particular were big risks that you can remember taking?
Well, vision is I think best communicated in decisions. When we did that here, before we went multi-site, we were just a little church at 230, and we invested and bought a community college campus. So it was 22 acres and 64,000 square foot under roof, and we had no way of knowing how we would even use that space. So we made a big choice early on, and then our first multi-site was a former grocery store that was 57,000 square feet, 60 miles away from Quincy. So we didn't know anybody in that town. We made that big investment, and people were enthralled by that. There's not a lot that happens in a town. I mean, Macomb's a town of 13,000 permanent residents. And we were on the front page 6 times before we opened. So, those kinds of investment were pivotal for us. That kind of decision-making is pivotal for us. It's risky, but we had a set of leaders that were really wanting to take new ground. And we've never really slowed down that much in the process. I mean, we've been opening campuses ever since. And the reason is it's not a competitive environment. Rural churches and micropolitan churches tend to have an incredible amount of inertia. It's too hard for them to make these kinds of decisions to do innovative things, and so they get stuck in the traditions of their past, and so those churches don't tend to attract younger people. They don't really become vibrant. And so if we go into a community like that and we launch big, it's very exciting for people. And they flock to it. So I don't know if that exactly answers your question, but that's something that I think is worth telling.
Absolutely. Well, I love that. I love the breakthrough imagery that you use. I love the idea that there's going to be a mess, right? There's going to be a mess that happens, but you're also going to get through those barriers. And I didn't know if maybe there was a story you could share just about a breakthrough that you or your team had in reaching out to a community, a rural community in particular. Maybe some story where there was both that amazing breakthrough the barrier, maybe a mess was involved, but that the payoff was found in being willing to achieve the breakthrough.
Well, one of the big issues for us was technology. So when we first did this, it was around 2006 that we launched our first location. We didn't have the technology. The technology really didn't exist in our area to stream. So because it was still dial-up, and we didn't have any internet speed, and we had adopted Life Church's model, so we really valued live, and we actually had a tech guy at the time that discovered a technology that was being used for hazard signs in Chicago, and it was like how they would stream to hazard signs, and we used that to actually stream our services back when it was standard definition. And it worked great. When we went to high definition, we had a huge mess. But I mean, think about this. We were launching a location, spending a lot of money, and didn't even have the technology to pull it off. But we had it by the time we actually were able to launch. And that was a mess. That's a scary time. And then when we went from standard definition to high definition, that technology completely failed us. And so we had another mess on our hands. And what we had to end up doing was getting satellite dishes, buying satellite time, installing dishes at locations. And we did that until fiber caught up with us. Now, of course, we're all back to that kind of technology. I think we use Resi technology, and it's high definition, on demand, however you want it. But we'd made a lot of decisions that were so forward thinking that if God didn't intervene, we were just going to have and we did have messes. We had huge messes, but people in rural communities appreciate the effort, and they'll stick with you. As a matter of fact, if you don't just keep doing that over and over, they actually get excited about when you're failing in front of them. And they'll refuse to fail. And that's like when their faith goes way up. It's really pretty neat.
Interesting. We have a comment from Roger Weaver. I just wanted to throw out that Tulia, Texas has acquired a 4,500 square foot building on the square downtown and a population of 6,000. And they've gone ahead and commenced their renovations. So again, a great little story about a community or a church that's risking high in order to reach their community. So we can be in prayer for the work there in Tulia. I have a question here from Jocko Jans van Rensburg. He asks, what would you say is the minimum requirement for your church to start out in a rural community? Is that a local leader, or what do you initially put your faith out for? Where do you choose to start?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, there's been an evolution in how we viewed church, and we're not particularly smart people. So a lot of this stuff we backed into. We didn't walk into it with our eyes wide open. We didn't have any idea. I'll give you an example. So when I first started doing this, our first one 2006, our next one 2007, we thought that we could only go to communities over 10,000, and we needed a space that was this big, and we need to have this many seats in our auditorium. And we had all these ideas about what our DNA was, our brand was. And it was not until our fourth location that we discovered something new. And that was never intended to be a location. It was in Quincy. It was in a downtown in a more economically challenged area. And one of our guys on staff at the time was running Celebrate Recovery, and he wanted a long-term discipleship program for people going through recovery, like where they could live. And there were these two buildings. One of them was an old shotgun, German-speaking Lutheran church. And then the second building behind it was like their fellowship area. And the property was only like $65,000. And he said, could we do this, convert it, and turn it into this long-term living space for discipleship? I thought it was a great idea. So we bought the facility, paid cash for the facility, and started doing some renovation. And the city, actually, the community around these buildings decided to rise up against us and said, we don't want people that are going through alcohol and drug recovery living in our neighborhood in this fashion. And I remember going, well, so what are we going to do? I mean, we don't want to like be against the community we're in. Mm-hmm. So we pivoted and said, well, it's already zoned as a church. We'll just open a church there. I mean, it's not what we thought church was. So we opened this church. We ended up spending about another $50,000 to put all our packaging in to make it look like us. So we only had like 115 grand in the building. And there was maybe 150 seats total in the balcony and down below. And that church started to grow like mad. Mm-hmm. And we just had two guys that were on the other church staff that were coming down there and like running services on the weekend. And that church grew to be 500 people. And these were people that would drive past our big location to go to this small location. And this is what we learned in that. We learned that people in our area will give up amenity for community. That they wanted community more. They wanted to go to church in their neighborhood. They wanted to invite their friends. And the vibe in that space was incredible. It was amazing. And it's, thriving even now in the midst of COVID, just thriving like crazy. I was there attending one of their services a couple of weeks ago. It just is great. It's just awesome. So what that taught us is we could actually go into smaller spaces, things that we thought were our DNA really weren't our DNA. And we changed our metric to go down. We're in one community that's only 125 people. And we have a church that runs more than the community, but it's just in a rural area. And that was an acquisition, $1 million building they just handed us the keys to. So we learned a lot from that facility on you can go into really small spaces and medium-sized spaces. And of course, that opened up a whole a panorama of spaces that we could bring our church, our particular way of doing church. And I want to add one thing to this, if it's not too much. I was at a meeting in New York with Jim Tomberlin and Todd Wilson running this meeting, and there were probably maybe a dozen or so leaders. And one of the leaders there was a guy named David Ashcraft, and he is a pastor at LCBC Church in Manheim, Pennsylvania. LCBC used to be Lancaster County Bible Church. It's not a Restoration Movement church, and now it's they've branched out multi-site, and now it's Lives Changed by Christ. And he was trying to figure something out because they couldn't figure out how to export their church into other locations without spending $8 million. They said the minimum amount of money that we need for our DNA to be transported into another location is $8 million. And his vision was to have 100 churches in Pennsylvania. And he was trying to figure out how we were doing it so cheap. And I wrote a book about it called Micropolitan Church about 10 years ago. And he had read that book and he wanted to talk to me. He was one of the guys at this meeting. And I said, you just need to come out. And he brought 13 people out. And this is a church that's 18,000 people. It's a big church. And he brought 13 of his lead staff out. And he was struggling. I was taking him to different locations, showing him stuff, and he was struggling. And he got to that one location, the one I just told you about, 929. And he pulled together his lead team, and he goes, you know what? We know how to do this. This is how we started the church. And they completely revamped their launch program for their multi-sites across Pennsylvania. And they were able to drop the cost of location by 75%. So this idea of being able to like connect rural church ministry with multi-site ministry has got incredible potential. Like maybe there are people like that are listening, and they're in maybe a suburban area, or I've got a bunch of guys that have come here with their lead teams about this, but they see these rural areas around them, and they want to be able to get into those communities. Well, I believe that now is the time, if there was ever a time, church needs to be more distributed than ever before. It needs to be, it doesn't need to be as monolithic as it used to be. I mean, remember these like huge juggernauts of churches in one location. I think that we need to break, like I would not right now, I don't want to say never, but I will never build another location with an auditorium that seats more than 400. I would, because a smaller location and more of those are better. So this guy that wrote in and said he's got 6,500 square feet. You can do a lot with 6,500 square feet in a town like that. So, and right now, I'll tell you, post-COVID, there's going to be a lot of buildings for sale.
True.
So this is this is a great opportunity for a church renaissance. I really believe. Anyway, my opinion.
Great word. I think we're going to see not only some consolidation, but also the opportunity for us to become much more localized, right? Much more intentional about being. That's such an interesting story that you share about the larger church coming, not being able to reproduce themselves for less than the $8 million mark. Sometimes we get so busy doing the things that we're doing. We get so busy with programs. We get so busy that we forget those essentials. We forget that, hey, wait a second, this is how the church started, right? Or this is what evangelism means. And I love in the 4 lessons section of your talk, really talking about, getting to that point where introducing people to Jesus has to be that passion, has to be that point of go, has to be the reason why we do something like step into a rural community and take a big risk. So maybe you can just share a little bit. How do you keep your staff evangelistic in their mindset? How do you specifically help them focus on introducing people to Jesus?
Well, it has to become high value. And we valued this for a long time. Like in our services, one component of our service, now we incorporate it into one of our worship songs, but we will always show last week's baptisms. And we do the way we film that montage is they're always black and white, and when they come out of the water, it goes to color. We focus in on what happens. We don't focus on what happens pre going down in the water. We focus on what happens after that. So like in the water, you'll see people come up and they got this smile on their face and they start hugging the people that are baptizing them. And we show the joy of that. And I think it's been 13 years at the Crossing since we had a weekend without a baptism. So we normally have probably 10 to 15 a weekend. And it'll say, this campus, this campus, this campus. And our people celebrate it. They're hollering, they're clapping, they're excited when they see it. So congregationally, it's valued. From a staff perspective, it's valued. I think I mentioned in the talk that like 5,000 baptisms in the last 6 years. And 90% of those are adults. So it's not, I'm I'm the publisher of Christian Standard, so I have the opportunity to see like the metrics of what our churches are doing. And you can say that you're evangelistic, but your numbers should reflect it.
Right.
And so that is that's our number one core value, that we'll do whatever it takes to reach people far from God. I mean, that's just what we'll do. And so, like, you have to be intentional in your services. You have to speak in plain language so people understand that. You can't lose people that are committed in your teaching, but you have to recognize, like, every week, like we have communion every week. So that means every week you have to explain what it is. Because we're expecting that there's a lot of people there that have no idea what you're talking about. I've taught my staff, tell me, what was your first experience going into a Muslim mosque? Well, most of them have never done that before.
Right.
But how would you feel? I mean, if you walked into something that was completely strange from a religious standpoint, you wouldn't know anything. You wouldn't know what to do, where to stand, you wouldn't know, and you'd be so scared that you're just going to look foolish. And I'm saying that in the American church today, in a post-Christian culture, people have no idea. They have no idea. And so you have to be able to make things as plain and as accessible as possible. And at the same time, not dumb it down so far that, committed believers can't connect with what you're doing. But I would say another thing that we teach at the Crossing is that we measure maturity, Christian maturity, by 4 words, and that is, it's not about you. If you're still a consumer, if it's still all about you, then you're not mature as a believer. So we set, one of our core values is that we will give up the things that we love to reach a generation that we love even more. That's our second core value. And so mature believers don't get frustrated that we're not doing something that we did in 1975, because, that's only, things that we did, a lot of churches are only relevant to the dead. And we need to be relevant to the people that are around us. And I think that's why a lot of churches are dying, because they can't do that. They can't make that pivot. And that's why going into a rural community with some kick butt church is so exciting, because there's nothing else going on. And people, they're curious and they want to see what it's like, and they want to talk to their friends about it. So they come and they share. And it's awesome. It's incredible when that happens. I know Quincy, Illinois is a very Catholic community. That's 8 parishes and high school and elementary schools. And I know that the Catholic churches in Quincy, actually, if you go to a crossing, you have to do penance to go back to the Catholic Church. You have to say this many Our Fathers and this many Hail Marys because you actually went to the crossing. So, because it's completely out of their norm. Anyway, I'm getting a little tangential, but there you go.
Well, appreciate those thoughts. Really some great things. I'd love to have more time to just unpack a few of those things with you, Jerry, to be honest, and appreciate not only your leadership at the Crossing, but also I failed to mention at the beginning that you are also publisher of the Christian Standard. And so as a leader and staying in contact with so many leaders and churches around the country, your point of view and point of vision for a lot of the things that we talk about today is really important. And so we are grateful for your willingness to come and be a part of this Spirecast. Thank you for your talk at the virtual conference 2020. Thank you for all that you do for Spire Network and to continue to do. Thank you for your leadership at the Crossing and for also the work you do with the Christian Standard. I really appreciate the opportunity to bring you this Spirecast today as we continue at Spire Network to bring the resources and to inspire inspire leaders who lead healthy, growing churches. We hope that you'll continue to join us on our Spirecasts. They happen on Monday at around the same time, 9 o'clock Mountain Time, 11 o'clock Eastern Time. And we look forward to continuing to bring you some of the best content, some of the best leaders, and some of the best inspiration as you continue to lead churches that are healthy and growing around the country. So thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you next time. Again, don't forget to sign up for the webinar on Wednesday if you haven't at spire.network/webinars on embracing engagement. We look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks so much. Take care.
Thanks, Chris.